Chapter 9. And so Edward Tulane became Susanna. Nellie sewed several outfits for him: a pink dress with ruffles for special occasions, a simple shift fashioned out of a flower-covered cloth for everyday use, and a long white gown made of cotton for Edward to sleep in. In addition, she remade his ears, stripping them of the few pieces of fur that remained and designing him a new pair. Oh, she told him when she was done, you look lovely. He was horrified at first. He was, after all, a boy rabbit. He did not want to be dressed as a girl, and the outfits, even the special occasion dress, were so simple, so plain. They lacked the elegance and artistry of his real clothes. But then Edward remembered lying on the ocean floor, the muck in his face, the stars so far away, and he said to himself, what difference does it make, really? Wearing a dress won't hurt me. Besides, life in the little green house with the fisherman and his wife was sweet. Nellie loved to bake, and so she spent her day in the kitchen. She put Edward on the counter and leaned him up against the flour canister and arranged his dress around his knees. She bent his ears so that he could hear well. And then she set to work, kneading dough for bread and rolling out dough for cookies and pies. The kitchen soon filled with the smell of baking bread and with the sweet smells of cinnamon and sugar and cloves. The windows steamed up, and while Nellie worked, she talked. She told Edward about her children, her daughter Lolly, who was a secretary, and her boys Ralph, who was in the army, and Raymond, who had died of pneumonia when he was only 5 years old. He drowned inside of himself, said Nellie. It is a horrible, terrible thing, the worst thing to watch somebody you love die right in front of you and not be able to do nothing about it. I dream about him most nights. Nellie wiped at her tears with the back of her hands. She smiled at Edward. I suppose you think I'm dumb, talking to a toy, but it seems to me that you are listening, Susanna. And Edward was surprised to discover that he was listening. Before, when Adeline talked to him, everything had seemed so boring, so pointless. But now, the stories Nellie told struck him as the most important thing in the world, and he listened as if his life depended on what she said. It made him wonder if some of the muck from the ocean floor had gotten inside his china head and damaged him somehow. In the evening, Lawrence came home from the sea, and there was dinner, and Edward sat at the table with the fisherman and his wife. He sat in an old wooden high chair, and while at first he was mortified, a high chair, after all, was a chair designed for babies, not for elegant rabbits, he soon became used to it. He liked being up high, looking out over the table instead of staring at the tablecloth as he had at the Tulane household. He liked feeling like a part of things. Every night after dinner, Lawrence said that he thought he would go out and get some fresh air, and that maybe Susanna would like to come with him. He placed Edward on his shoulder, as he had that first night when he walked him through town, bringing him home to Nellie. They went outside, and Lawrence lit his pipe and held Edward there on his shoulder. And if the night was clear, Lawrence said the names of the constellations one at a time: Andromeda, Pegasus, pointing at them with the stem of his pipe. Edward loved looking up at the stars, and he loved the sound of the constellation names. They were sweet in his ears. Sometimes, though, staring up at the night sky, Edward remembered Pellegrina, saw again her dark and glowing eyes, and a chill would go through him. Warthogs, he would think, witches. But Nellie, before she put him to bed each night, sang Edward a lullaby, a song about a mockingbird that did not sing, and a diamond ring that would not shine. And the sound of Nellie's voice soothed the rabbit, and he forgot about Pellegrina. Life for a very long time was sweet. And then Lawrence and Nellie's daughter came for a visit. Chapter 10. Lolly was a lumpy woman who spoke too loudly and wore too much lipstick. She entered the house and immediately spotted Edward sitting on the living room couch. What's this? She said. She put down her suitcase and picked Edward up by one foot. She held him upside down. That's Susanna, said Nellie. Susanna, shouted Lolly. She gave Edward a shake. His dress was up over his head and he could see nothing. Already he formed a deep hatred for Lolly. Your father found her, said Nellie. She came up in a net and she didn't have no clothes on, so I made her some dress. Have you got skivvy? Shouted Lolly. Rabbits don't need clothes. Well, said Nellie, her voice shook. This one seemed to. Lolly tossed Edward back on the couch. He landed face down with his arms over his head and his dress still over his face, and he stayed that way through dinner. "Why have you got that old high chair out?" shouted Lolly. "Oh, don't pay it no mind," said Nellie. "Your father was just gluing a missing piece, weren't you, Lawrence?" "That's right," said Lawrence, without looking up from his plate. Of course, after dinner, Edward did not go outside and stand beneath the stars to have a smoke with Lawrence. And Nellie, for the first time since Edward had been with her, did not sing him a lullaby. In fact, Edward was ignored and forgotten about until the next morning, when Lolly picked him up again and pulled his dress down from his face and stared him in the eye. "Got the old folks bewitched, don't you?" said Lolly. "I heard the talk in town that they've been treating you like a rabbit child." Edward stared back at Lolly. Her lipstick was a bright and bloody red. He felt a breeze blow through the room. Was a door open somewhere? "Well, you don't fool me," she said. She gave him a shake. "We'll be taking a trip together, you and me." Holding Edward by the ears, Lolly marched into the kitchen and shoved him face down in the garbage can. "Ma," Lolly shouted, "I'm taking the truck. I'm going to head out and do some errands." "Oh," said Nellie's voice, "that's wonderful, dear. Goodbye, then." "Goodbye," thought Edward as Lolly hauled the garbage can out to the truck. "Goodbye," Nellie called again, louder this time. Edward felt a sharp pain somewhere deep inside his china chest. For the first time, his heart called out to him. It said two words: Nellie, Lawrence. Chapter 11. Edward ended up at the dump. He lay on top of orange peels, coffee grounds, bacon, and rubber tires. The first night, he was at the top of the garbage heap, and so he was able to look up at the stars and find comfort in their light. In the morning, a short man came climbing through the trash and rubble. He stopped when he was standing on top of the highest pile. He put his hands under his armpits and flapped his elbows. The man crowed loudly. He shouted, "Who am I? I'm Ernest, Ernest who is king of the world. How can I be king of the world? Because I am king of garbage, and garbages is what the world is made of. Ha ha ha, therefore I am Ernest, Ernest who is the king of the world," he said again. Edward was inclined to agree with Ernest's assessment of the world being made of garbage, especially after his second day at the dump when a load of trash was put directly on top of him. He lay there, buried alive. He could not see the sky. He could not see the stars. He could see nothing. What kept Edward going, what gave him hope, was thinking of how he would find Lolly and exact his revenge. He would pick her up by the ears. He would bury her under a mountain of trash. But after almost 40 days and nights had passed, the weight and smell of the garbage above and below him clouded Edward's thoughts, and soon he gave up thinking about revenge and gave into despair. It was worse, much worse than being buried at sea. It was worse because Edward was a different rabbit now. He couldn't say how he was different. He just knew that he was. He remembered again Pellegrina's story about the princess who had loved nobody. The witch turned her into a warthog because she loved nobody. He understood that now. He heard Pellegrina say, "You disappoint me." "Why?" he asked her. "Why do I disappoint you?" But he knew the answer to that question too. It was because he had not loved Abilene enough, and now she was gone from him, and how he would never be able to make it right. And Nellie and Lawrence were gone too. He missed them terribly. He wanted to be with them. The rabbit wondered if that was love. Day after day passed, and Edward was aware of time passing only because every morning he could hear Ernest performing his dawn ritual, cackling and crowing about being king of the world. On his 180th day at the dump, help arrived for Edward in a most unusual form. The garbage around him shifted, and the rabbit heard the sniffing and panting of a dog. Then came the frenzied sound of digging. The garbage moved again, and suddenly, miraculously, the beautiful buttery light of late afternoon shone on Edward's face.